and Festival Director William Dalrymple.
Sandy came to our festival when it was a rather smaller affair than it is now. And I think we had an audience last time of about 25 for him. So things have got bigger. Sandy, you had a perfectly sensible job for quite a lot of your life.
Yes.
What went wrong?
I decided to get an honest job. Well, I gave up the honest job. Actually, I'm just adjusting my mic. Willie, I must tell our unfortunate Mike story. You may have forgotten it, but we had a wonderful experience with mics. Some years ago, we were doing that. Am I actually audible? Yes. We were doing the Edinburgh New Year Hogmanay event, and we were backstage. Willie and I were doing a joint appearance on that occasion, as indeed now. And we were backstage getting ready, and we had these lapel mics on. And Willie, this was in the green room before the event began. And Willie said to me, how old are your readers? And I said, well, my readers are arranged. I've got some very young readers, and I've got some not so young readers. And then he said, well, my readers are really ancient. And that's the point at which the organizers could be seen running down the corridor towards us, waving their arms, and you transmitted that into the hall. But I said to him, well, look, don't worry, even if it is the case that we were transmitted into the hall, if your readers are that old, they won't have heard you. So it just actually goes to show you have to be terribly careful about these microphones. As Gordon Brown discovered, he had a microphone experience when he unwisely said what he thought of a voter just before an election. Anyway. Well, I mean, poor man. It really was. It was the end of a difficult session, and somebody came, and one of the voters came and complained to him. Which is really, politicians don't like that. And he and he said, I think he got into the car. He was still connected to the mic and transmitting to the journalists, which wasn't very good. And he said, somebody said to him in the car, who was that, this voter? And he was very uncomplimentary in what he said about this woman, who was asking a perfectly reasonable question, as you did, but I've forgotten what your question was. What did you ask me, Willie?
I suggested that you once had a sensible job and gave it up for the literary life.
Well, yes, I did. I used to be a professor of law. I was professor of medical law at the University of Edinburgh.
Which is not a particularly humorous subject, one presumes.
Well, it has its moments, I mean, are you suggesting it's dull? And these historians feel everything else is very, very boring. But in fact, it was a perfectly interesting. It was a very interesting job. I liked it very much indeed. But I was always writing
at the University of Edinburgh.
At the University of Edinburgh. But I always wrote in my spare time. I had always, as most of us, I mean, you probably had I think you did have your first book published when you were 16, but most of us a little bit later. I sent my first manuscript off at the age of 8. I wrote a book and I sent it off to a publisher, and it was probably about 2 pages. And I remember what the title was. The title was He's Gone. But who he was and where he went and why, I can't remember. But the publisher wrote a very nice letter back.
He didn't come back.
He didn't come back. So I was writing in my spare time, and I wrote quite a number of children's books. I wrote, I think, about 35 children's books, which I'd got involved in doing by accident, in that there was a literary competition run by Chambers, the dictionary people, publishers, and I entered in 2 categories. One was a novel for adults, and the other was a novel for children. And I very much hoped that I'd win the novel for adults category, but I won the novel for children. And so I rather drifted into that, and once I'd had one published, there were requests for more. So I wrote all those children's books, and I was then writing short stories as well. and various things. And then,
And how did you do that with a proper university job?
well, what I did was I did it in my.
Could we have handheld mics, as these aren't working very well?
I did it in my spare time. So you know, I would write in evenings, weekends, etc. And of course. Okay, yeah, and so that's how I did it, and then eventually I sat down, and that must have been in about 1996, I think, round about then. I decided to write what I thought was going to be a short story about a woman who lives in Botswana, which is a country that I had quite a long connection with.
Marutswami.
Maramatswe, and I thought that I would write a short story about this woman who, her father, she's at the deathbed of her father, Obed Ramotswe, a very fine man, good judge of cattle, very nice man, and he says, when I die, sell the cattle and start a little business, and he thinks it should be a hardware store or something of that sort, and she says brightly, I know, I'll start a detective agency, and he gasps and expires. And so off she goes. And I rather liked the character, so I made the thing not just a short story, but it grew into a full-length novel. And I thought that that would be it. I thought that I'd said what I wanted to say about Mara Matsui, and I'd said what I particularly
The number
wanted
one ladies detective.
Number one ladies detective. And so that was published, and it was published to no great effect in the UK. It was published by a small publisher in Scotland. We had some quite generous reviews, but then it was imported by Columbia University Press in New York, and they started to sell it. And gradually they sold a few more copies, and then the New York Times did a full-page article about the first 4 of those books, because I'd done sequels, because I was then beginning to be affected by a condition which is a known risk in the literary world called serial novelism. And it's quite a serious condition. The symptoms are that you just write novel after novel in a serial. There's no known cure. You write novel after novel and then you die. And that's, for example, Patrick O'Brien, with his Jack Aubrey, those wonderful historical naval novels, he wrote 20 of those, and he's now dead. And, which is most unfortunate. We shouldn't laugh, you know. But, of course, for many authors, dying is a really good career move. You know.
You get better reviews when you're dead.
Exactly. Well, you know, funny enough, I was doing a signing in Atlanta, Georgia, last year, and in the signing queue, this lady came up to me, very politely. Her intention was in no sense hostile.
I can see where this is going.
Unlike most signing queues, and she came up to me and she said, and very politely, you know something, you're going to be far more successful posthumously.
You didn't think on acting on her advice, though.
Well, you know, you get some very odd things happen in signing queues. On that, a previous American tour, I was in North Carolina, and I was doing a signing in a bookstore there, and there was this man in the queue who was looking at me very intensely. And I had somebody beside me who was the keeper provided for that particular bit of the tour, who was a bodyguard. I actually had a bodyguard. I had a gun. And I said, there's this man in the queue, and I'm a little bit worried about him. And the bodyguard said, yeah, okay, I got him. He didn't actually shoot him. But anyway, he came up to the table, and he leant across the table and said, what are you doing afterwards? And, you know, this was a real shock. And, I mean, there are some people who ask that question more frequently. I mean, I've never asked that. And my keeper said, oh, no, he's leaving town, that's it. And then he reached for a bag, and I thought, right, now there's going to be some altercation. He reached for a bag, and what was in it was his book. He just wanted me to read his book, and he'd printed this privately. He'd written a book. And so I was mightily relieved that this was the sole agenda. And so I took it He didn't even want me to write to him about it, because normally people say, would you then write and give me further advice on what I should write next or whatever. So he didn't ask for that, so I took the book back to the hotel, and honestly, Willie, it was a wonderful read. I only read about 3 pages, but it was 500. It was 500 pages, and it was all about a man who was kidnapped by a shipload of nuns.
There could have been a series of that.
Well, you see, he was a little bit early for 50 Shades of Grey, you see, because, I mean, poor man, that hadn't happened yet. He was before his time, because it was out. Mind you, 50 Shades of Grey, you know, many people don't realize that there's an interesting history behind that book, because that's published by my New York publishers. My publisher actually discovered that. She was surfing on the internet, and she noticed this. And it used to be, many people...
Where was she surfing?
Well, no, Willie, you see, this is the point. Many people don't realize that that started off as a book on interior decoration. It was purely on interior decoration. And the publishers received this, and it was all about color coordination in the home. And they said, this needs spicing up. Where were we?
Returning to Maramotswe. So you wrote one of these, and you're now on number 16.
I've written, yes, number 16 was The Woman Who Walked in Sunshine, and that was published last October. And I've just started volume 17. I started that when I was over in Chennai. I sat down in the hotel and began, and I will be writing more of it here in Jaipur. Courtesy of yourselves. And, while
I hope your hotel is comfortable.
It's very, very comfortable. So I'll be writing more of that, and that'll appear in October.
And how do you? I mean, what is your writing schedule? Because you seem to produce 3 or 4 books a year, every year.
Yes, I do. That's breaking all known rules of publishing. You know,
Yeah.
we're meant not to write one book a year. Every other year is the general thing. But, well, I get up very early. I often start at about 4 o'clock, 3:30, 4 o'clock, and I find that those early hours of the morning, or sort of late hours of the early morning, are very, very productive.
Because no one's around, no one's calling you.
No one's around, nobody's calling me, but it's also, I think the mind is quite fresh at that stage in the morning.
Depends what time you've gone to bed.
It depends what time you've gone to bed. But you know, we're respectable. I live in Edinburgh, and we're very respectable.
I remember.
So we're in bed by 9:30. So there we are.
Which brings us to Scotland Street.
Scotland Street, yes. Well, I've done volume 10 of that. The last book in the Scotland Street saga was volume 10, which was The Revolving Door of Life.
And what's Bertie up to?
Oh, poor little Bertie. Bertie's one of my favorite characters. Some of you may have read about Bertie. Bertie's a little boy he's 7. He started off in volume 1, which was about 10 years ago. He was 6, and he was 6 for 8 years. And everybody else was moving on. But I liked Bertie the way he is, so I've recently given him a 7th birthday, but just, and rather grudgingly, because Bertie was becoming increasingly concerned, and his friends were saying, isn't it about time you had a birthday, Bertie? But Bertie's problem is his mother, and indeed, I think that's a universal truth that small boys of 6 or 7, do, if you ask them, what's your problem in life, they will usually say their mother. Mother is usually the problem, because mothers can be very pushy, and so the pushy mother is Bertie's problem. His mother's called Irene, and she's very, very pushy. We have a serious problem of excessively pushy mothers in Edinburgh. We have the highest incidence of pushy mothers anywhere.
You haven't been in Delhi. You should try the Punjabi mothers.
Oh no, I know. Well, you see, that's the reason why Bertie's popular in India.
Bertie hasn't been made to do Bharatanatyam dancing by his 3rd birthday.
Well, Bertie being 6, his mother makes him learn Italian so he can appreciate Italian culture. He goes to yoga lessons called Yoga for Tots, where the children are so small they can't even sit up, so they have to be pushed into the yoga positions by their pushy mothers. he learns the saxophone. He does a very good rendition of As Time Goes By from Casablanca, which in his case it doesn't. And he has psychotherapy. He goes for psychotherapy with Dr. Hugo Fairbairn, author of that classic of child psychotherapy, Shattered to Pieces, Ego Dissolution in a 3-year-old Tyrant. And little Bertie, he just wants to be an ordinary boy, as most of these little boys want to do. He wants to be an ordinary boy, and in particular he wants to have a Swiss Army penknife, which is what most little boys, and indeed most men.
I remember being forbidden one by my mother,
Well,
by my Edinburgh mother.
Well, have you discussed that in psychotherapy? But little Bertie, he goes to an advanced kindergarten. While he's at his advanced kindergarten, his mother goes to a floatarium where she floats to de-stress. And she's at her floatarium one day while Bertie's at his advanced kindergarten, and her cell phone goes. She gets out of her flotation chamber, and it's the principal of the advanced kindergarten, Miss Christabel McFadgen, on the line, who says, would you kindly come up to the advanced kindergarten? There has been an incident. And so Irene goes off to the advanced kindergarten to be greeted by a hatchet-faced Miss McFadgen. Says, there's been an incident. One of the children has written graffiti on the toilet wall. And Irene bristles and says, well, why do you look at me? Why do you think it's my Bertie? And Miss McFadgen says, because he's the only one who can write. and then she adds, and it's in Italian. Poor little Bertie. I do actually give him a break from time to time. He went fishing with his father in the Pendant Hills, almost caught a trout, not quite. And then they got lost, and they ended up at a farmhouse, invited by the farmer's wife in, and went in, and there was a real little boy called Andy, who was reading a real little boy's life. And he says to Bertie, would you like to see my things, Bertie? Bertie says, yes, please. He goes up to Andy's room, and Andy opens a drawer, and there is not one, but 6 Swiss Army penknives. And Bertie's little heart fills with joy at the sight. And Andy picks up one of these penknives and says, this, Bertie, is a Swiss Army penknife. The Swiss Army fights only with penknives. And that's a little known fact, actually.
And you put your friends from Edinburgh into Scotland Street?
I do, yes. And I think you have appeared.
I appeared once.
You've appeared
and
in Scotland Street. And I'll give you another walk on roll if you'd like.
I'd love one, thank you.
You can even say something if you wish. But I do know, I like putting real people in. I always get their permission, and they never do anything that would cause them any distress. So anybody who appears in my books, a real person,
is very well behaved.
Very well behaved.
I turned up at a dinner party, I think.
Is that you applied to that,
yeah. And then you've got the Dr. Eaglesfeld.
Yes, that's my Portuguese irregular verb series. There are 4 books in that. There's the first one is called Portuguese irregular verbs. Second one is called the finer points of sausage dogs. Third one was called At the Villa of Reduced Circumstances. And then the final, or not the final one, because I will write more, but the 4th one was called Unusual Uses for Olive Oil. And this is about...
This isn't published by the same publisher as 50 Shades of Grey as well?
No.
You can spice it up with a little chili oil.
No, it's entirely respectable.
And Isabel Dalhousie?
Isabel Dalhousie continues, yes.
Volume 10?
Volume 10 was the last one. That was called The Novel Habits of Happiness. And Isabel, I really like as a character. She's a philosopher. She's a moral philosopher to trade. She runs something called the Review of Applied Ethics. And she's married to a much younger man. She's got a much younger man who had in fact been the boyfriend of her niece, Kat. And her niece, Kat, consistently had the wrong sort of boyfriends, as nieces often do, get the wrong sort of boyfriend. And she got one decent boyfriend, who was this young musician, a bassoonist called Jamie. And of course, because he was decent, Kat got rid of him. And Isabel continued a friendship because she rather liked him. She's 14 years older than he is, but she rather liked him. And I thought that was just going to be a platonic friendship between them. but I came under increasing pressure.
From the same publisher again.
Well, yes, I came under increasing pressure to change that. And I did an interview for a journalist from the Daily Express in London who said to me, "You must let Isabel and that young man have an affair." And I was shocked by this suggestion. And I pointed out that we lived in Edinburgh and we didn't go in for that sort of thing in Edinburgh. And I said, well, why should they have an affair anyway? And she said, it would be very empowering for your female readers over 40. And so I did let it happen. And I received many letters from female readers over 40 who said they were indeed empowered by this.
Did they make merry with the olive oil? Or what?
So there they are, and I do enjoy Isabel because it gives me the opportunity to talk about all sorts of interesting ethical issues because of her interest in applied ethics.
That's the closest, in a sense, to your old life that it comes
Yes,
back into.
yes, indeed, yes.
But you don't just do series, as if producing 4 or 5 books a year for the series isn't enough. There's My Italian Bulldozer is the new...
Well, I've just finished writing My Italian Bulldozer, and that'll be published in the UK in July or August, I think. I really enjoyed that. That's set in Montalcino. That's actually based on a real experience I had, which perhaps I could tell you about.
Yeah, please do.
Because it was the inspiration for and the model for this novel. What had actually happened was, I don't know what you like to do, Willie, but I rather like getting away to write from time to time. You go away from your normal life and you get concentrated time to work. I decided that I'd go off to Italy for a couple of weeks.
I think we just missed you there.
Well, indeed, that's right, yes. Well, I decided to go off to Italy to do some writing, and I wanted to go to a place called Montalcino, which you will know.
Very good wine.
A very nice place which produces this famous wine, Brunello di Montalcino, which is one of the finest Italian wines. Anyway, I decided to go off. I had permission to go off for a couple of weeks, and I went on a plane from Edinburgh to Pisa, and I started to talk to a chap sitting next to me in the plane, and he was an Italian businessman who'd been in Scotland. He sold ceramics, tiles, bathroom tiles, that sort of thing. And he was very, you know how friendly the Italians are. We had a nice conversation. And we arrived, plane landed in Pisa, and we said goodbye, and off we went to get our luggage. I then went to the car rental place. I had rented a car, I had hired a car, and I had an email, printed out email, of confirming this fact. But when I went to the office, they said, no record of this. And I said, well, what about this email here? There's the booking. And they said, no longer operative. And so I was really stuck. And I said, well, give me another car. And they said, no cars left because it was a holiday weekend, all the cars out. And then my new friend walked past, and he saw this, and he said, is there any problem? I said, well, I had reserved this car, no car, and I'm really stuck. And he said, don't worry, I know somebody who's got a vehicle renting place. I'll take you along to this vehicle rental place, and we'll get you fixed up. And again, that was an example of Italian friendliness and helpfulness. So we went off to this other place, and I met his friend, and his friend said, alas, all my cars are out. I've rented them all. However, I do have a bulldozer. And so I said, well, you know, I can't drive a bulldozer. My license won't be valid. I'm licensed to drive a car. He said, no, in Italy, if you've got a UK car license and license, you can drive a bulldozer. And so I was really stuck, and they were being so helpful, and I really couldn't refuse this bulldozer. So I said, well, okay, I'll take it. So I went off, and he showed me...
Was there room for your luggage on the bulldozer?
Oh, yes, it was. It's quite a lot of room. Yeah, it had a sort of thing at the back where you put spades and whatnot, and I put the suitcase in there. We got to the bulldozer. I went round just to inspect it for damage, make sure that it was fine. And we set off, and it was wonderful. I went by bulldozer from Pisa to Montalcino.
Did that take up the whole holiday? Or?
No, it took quite some time. There are a couple of aspects about driving a bulldozer.
It's about, what, it's about 100 kilometres? Or?
It's something like that. So it was quite a decent drive.
Average speed, 15 miles an hour?
It was quite a sort of souped up. You know, Italian bulldozers go fast.
It's the Lamborghini of bulldozers.
It was actually really very good. It did have tracks, but it had lightweight tracks, so you could go. The interesting thing about driving a bulldozer in Italy is that Italian drivers are very respectful of bulldozers. It's a sort of deep cultural
Which are not
thing.
normally respectful of
No,
other cars.
no, but bulldozers they are, I can tell you that. And so they were absolutely fine with the bulldozer. And also you get a very good view of the surrounding features of the countryside.
You can see over those horrible motorway.
Exactly.
Were you on the motorway?
No, side roads. No, didn't go on the... Bulldozers aren't allowed on the motorway, there's a sign. And so I was...
People have tried this before, have they?
But you can see all the features of the countryside, and if there are any features you don't like,
Did you leave a trail of destruction? The Taliban from Edinburgh arriving.
I arrived in Montalcino, and I went to book into the Albergo Giglio, lovely little inn, and they said, that's fine, you can leave the bulldozer around the back, park the bulldozer around the back. And I had a very good couple of weeks there, and did quite a lot. And I went and had coffee every morning. I'm going to finish shortly, this story doesn't go on too long. I went and had coffee in the morning in a lovely little fin de siècle cafe they've got there called the Peschetteria Italiana, and had coffee, and I got to know the local priest who came with coffee at the same time. Very interesting conversations. He was very interested in Lombrosan criminology, and we sort of talked about that. And then just before I was due to go, he said, it was the day before I was due to go, he said, could you come and have lunch with my brother, who's got a winery, he's got a vineyard just at the edge of Montalcino. He's very keen that you should come round. And I said yes, and he said, could we go on your bulldozer? And I said, absolutely fine. So, because there were two seats, and I went off, and we had this wonderful Tuscan
Where
lunch.
did your wife go this time?
She wasn't there at
She
all.
wasn't there, right.
No, she remained in Scotland. And so we went there and we had this lunch. Beautiful Italian Tuscan beans, you know, lovely. They said simple Tuscan meal. It's about 6 courses. And then at the end he said, I'm just on the edge of the zone of production of Brunello di Montalcino. I'm just on the wrong side. So the grapes that I grow can't be used to produce Brunello di Montalcino. I have to produce simple Rosso di Montalcino, which is much cheaper, and I don't get such a good price. And the boundary between the zone of production of Brunello di Montalcino is a sort of earthenware long dike. And
Came to his rescue.
he said, could you possibly move? And so I moved the boundary of the zone of production
You have enlarged Brunello.
and moved it. And then we went inside. They were so grateful. And we went inside and we toasted it in what was now Brunello di Montalcino. That's absolutely true story.
And did you drive your bulldozer back again? I can look out for battered walls in Montalcino next summer.
Some people don't believe that story, but it actually did happen.
So, but it isn't all writing. It's a lot of writing, but it isn't all right. There is the really, really awful orchestra.
Really terrible orchestra.
Really
yes.
terrible orchestra.
Really terrible orchestra was founded by my wife and me about 20 years ago, when we realized that there was a call in Edinburgh for an amateur orchestra for people who really couldn't play their instruments, and for musically challenged people. And so we advertised, and we were absolutely inundated with requests to join, mostly from clarinetists. There are an awful lot of clarinetists, and I wondered about that.
And there's nothing more awful than a bad clarinet.
Oh, well, there is an awful violinist. is right. But we had all these applications from these clarinetists, and I wondered why it was that so many people appeared to play the clarinet. And then I realized it was because everybody learns the clarinet at school. It's absolutely standard thing for people to learn at school. And I suspect that virtually everybody here plays the clarinet. What happens is they learn it at school, then they forget about it. And it's only much later on when they're having psychotherapy that these repressed
Clarinet experiences come.
Repressed clarinet memories come surfacing. And so we had all these clarinetists. And we started, and it became very, very successful. We became effectively the worst bad orchestra in the world, the best known bad orchestra in the world. We went on tour to New York, believe it or not. We almost filled the New York Town Hall.
Do you all start at the same time, or?
No. Well, actually, we tend to start roughly at the same time, but we never finish at the same time. And indeed, you know, I am not making this up, really, but we actually had one occasion where, well, we had many occasions where the conductor actually has to stop us, but we had this occasion where the conductor stopped us and said, there's something seriously wrong here. And we wondered what it was, and we discovered that, in fact, one section of the orchestra was playing an entirely different piece of music, and they got mixed up. And so, we're hoping to go to Sweden next year. We were invited, for some reason best known to the Dutch government, to the Netherlands, and we went on tour
A
there.
double act with the Concertgebouw, or?
If something like that, yes. Well, not quite that level, but the next division down. And so we really do enjoy it. And in fact, I think there should be a really terrible orchestra which should play at your literary festival each year. You should start
right
one.
in.
Yeah.
Start one here in Jaipur. You need to get a professional conductor. We've got a professional conductor, but you don't actually have to pay him. You can get somebody who's doing community service, and who, if you speak to the local prosecution authorities and find out when the next conductor's appearing in court, it can be part of the plea bargain.
Let them off.
And you play the tuba.
Well, the tuba is one of the instruments that I have in the past played very badly. I started off playing the bassoon, and then I graduated to the contrabassoon, because its notes are less exposed. With the contrabassoon, it's with the deep instruments, people can't really hear you. And so I thought that was the instrument for me. And I played that, and then I got a bit bored with that because I found the top notes too difficult. And I then started to play the baritone saxophone, which is what I now play in the orchestra. It's not an orchestral instrument, but we're not a proper orchestra. So
And you no plans to tour India with?
well, I think that sounds like an invitation to the Jaipur Literary Festival. And Willie, we shall be here next year.
Thank you. and meanwhile, opera.
Yes, I did.
the Okavango Macbeth.
I wrote an opera called the Okavango Macbeth, which was set in the Okavango Delta in Botswana. What actually happened was that I was there with my New York agent and my New York editor, and we were...
Who's also been here.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Yes. We were on the river with a guide, and we saw these little buildings, little huts, underneath big trees. And I asked our guide who these were, and he said, that's the baboon people. And I realized then, I just read a book. I'm sort of vaguely interested in a very amateurish way in primatology, and I read a book called Baboon Metaphysics by two American primatologists who'd spent years studying this particular troop of baboons in the Okavango. I realized this was their camp. So I said to our guide, could we go and see them? And he said, no, we don't like to disturb them. And I said, I'm sure it would be all right. And eventually I prevailed on him. And we approached across the river. And as we approached, I cupped my hands and I shouted across the river, I've just read Baboon Metaphysics. And out of one of these huts, a figure came running, waving, calling us ashore. And I went on ashore and met them, and indeed were these people. And the book had been comparatively recently published, and they had yet to meet anybody who read it. And there we were in the middle of the Okavango Delta. Anyway, in the course of that conversation, they revealed to me that female baboons are very ambitious for their males.
It's like Edinburgh.
A little bit like Edinburgh. And indeed, it's Lady Macbeth.
Right.
Female baboons have Lady Macbeth issues. And so I decided to tell the Macbeth story set in a troop of baboons in the Okavango Delta, and we called it, I got a composer who was interested in writing that, and we wrote this opera called the Okavango Macbeth, and it ran for a week in a little opera house that I'd set up outside Cabroni called the Number One Ladies Opera House, which was a tiny little thing, 50 seats. But the singers who did it, we had only one trained voice, and the rest were just enthusiastic amateurs. And we had the most wonderful, they loved it, and it was a marvelous. And the production then, it went to Edinburgh, went to Cambridge. It has been and has been recorded, and it's very tuneful. The composer's
It's entered
Tom
the,
Cunningham.
entered the canon.
It's entered the canon in a very, very minor way, but it's every so often it will be performed. So I was very pleased to have done that.
And the other thing you've got going is you've done a reworking of Emma.
Yes, I was approached by Collins publishers to participate in what they called the Austen Project. And they'd asked a number of people to rewrite, or do a new version rather, of Jane Austen's novels. Now, Jane Austen, of course, doesn't require rewriting, but as you know, there are a whole lot of people who do sequels, prequels, new versions, and so on. And so it took me about 45 seconds of profound thought before I said yes, I'd do it. And Joanna Trollope did one of the others, Val McDermott did another, I was allocated Emma, and I had such fun doing it. I really, really enjoyed doing it, because Emma's, I think...
Where have you moved her to?
Well, I moved her, I actually was slightly tempted to move her to Tobermory in Scotland on the island of Mull, but I
Beautiful
realized
place.
that would be an act of cultural expropriation, because Jane Austen is very English, and I think to make Emma Scottish would, in my view, have been a bit of an expropriation. So I kept her in England, but I moved her further north to Norfolk, and so she's just outside Holt in Norfolk, because I wanted rural England, and of course rural England has considerably contracted, and I think if one put a modern Emma where the original Emma had taken place, she'd be in suburban London or under an airport runway or something of that sort. So I moved her out. And the challenge with Emma is that she's actually really rather unpleasant. But you can't actually portray her as being so unpleasant that the audience loses sympathy, not the audience, the reader loses sympathy with her.
And what's her lifestyle? She's got an Aga, she's a couple of Labradors? Or?
There are Argas. Her father's got an Aga because she's lost her mother.
An Aga's a bit like a Tandoor, but sort of,
Yes.
it's an English Tandoor.
So they do have an Aga. In the original Mr. Woodhouse, her father was very worried about drafts. He was very obsessive about drafts. He's worried about viruses now because it's the 21st century. And so it just brings the whole thing up to date. And it's a modern version. I so enjoy doing it.
Do you ever sort of have a real urge to kill off your characters? I mean, is Mara Motsway going to sort of fall down a cliff at some point or be eaten by a tiger? Or?
No, I couldn't do that, particularly with her, because I think that would bring such distress to the readers. I think people, it is extraordinary. When you're writing particularly serial novels, but I think this would apply to an extent with ordinary novels, but when you're writing novels in a series, people invest a lot of emotional energy in their relationship with the characters. And I think as the author, you actually do lose, to use a contemporary expression, you lose ownership of the characters. The characters actually then belong to the readers, and I recognize that. I mean, I get tremendous correspondence all the time, people who feel that they've got some sort of relationship with the characters in my books, and I treat that very seriously. I mean, sometimes they take it to extremes. I had a letter from some readers in New Zealand who said that they really enjoyed the Mara Motsway novels, and then they went on to say, this woman went on to say, my husband and I pretend to be Mara Motsway and Mr. J.L.B. Mashcone all the time. And they sit there drinking Redbush tea and calling one another Ma and Ra. And then I was in California some years ago. I was in a place called Santa Barbara, which is a very grand place in California, which you'll know well. And I was at this place, and I was invited to, I was doing an event, but I was invited to a reception after the event, dinner in this magnificent house, and I went along to it, and there were all the Santa Barbarians having fun in this...
Do they call themselves Santa Barbarians?
No, they don't. No. But I mean, yeah, they're probably Santa Barbarites or something like that. But anyway, these two ladies came up to me and said, your books have changed our lives. And I was obviously quite flattered by this, and I said, well, thank you very much. And then they told me in what respect. They said, we bought a van. And they bought a van like Mara Matsuy's tiny white van. They painted it white, and they put new number plates on it, which said TWV1, Tiny White Van 1. And they drive around Santa Barbara pretending to be Mara Matsui and Mama Guzzi. Californians actually often don't have enough to do. I don't think you notice that.
And do you write all these simultaneously? I mean, would you have Dr. What's he called?
Von Eaglefeld.
Von Eaglesfeld, sort of alternating with another morning you pick up the other manuscript of Mara Motsvay, or do you do one at a time?
I prefer to do one at a time, but often the schedule is such that I end up doing more than one. So at the moment I'm writing volume 11 of Scotland Street, and I've started the new Mara Motsvay, and I've got one or two other things. So I'm writing 3 books at the moment. I try to keep the worlds separate. Every so often, and this doesn't happen very often, I think it's probably only happened once or twice, I can cross over into the wrong fictional universe. I did this once with the Mara Motsvay book. My editor in New York contacted me, and he said, oh, page 40, whatever it is, of the new manuscript, Mara Motsvay is beginning to sound a bit like Isabel Dalhousie. And he was right.
Speaking in a Scottish accent?
Well, she started going on about sort of Kantian sense of obligation and whatnot, which Mara Motsvay normally doesn't, whereas Isabel might.
But I mean, literally, of a morning, I mean, this morning, for example,
Yes.
did you get up at 3 in the morning? And
I got up at about 2:30, 3 o'clock. Yes.
I saw you at the party last night at about 11.
Yes, I left reasonably. I think I was probably one of the earlier, the more respectable people left the party earlier on, and it was a very fine party. But no, I was up and.
So you're fine with 4 hours sleep?
No, I go back to bed. I write for a couple of hours, then I go back to bed, and I have a second sleep, which actually I find quite restorative. And also, because of the particular rhythm that one is in, the stage one is in the sleep cycle, I find that I have very vivid and amusing dreams in the hour before I wake up finally at about 8:30 in the morning.
And do you dream the books? Or do you dream
Well, I occasionally do. Occasionally I dream something which then will find its way into a book. I find that my dreams, and I think this might be a concomitant of being a novelist, my dreams actually have a sort of narrative feel to them. So I'm sort of vaguely, it's not quite lucid dreaming, but it sometimes approaches that in the sense that I'm aware of the fact that I'm in a story.
Yeah.
And that's quite interesting.
I definitely find, even with non-fiction, that if you have a manuscript by your bed
Yes.
and have been thinking all day about it,
Yes.
it's not quite dreaming, but it's there while you're sleeping, cooking.
Absolutely right. I think that the sleeping mind, or the unconscious mind at that stage, I suppose one might say one's subconscious mind, is indeed dealing with the experiences of the day and with the thoughts of the day. I mean, I think that's pretty obvious. But it also raises a rather interesting question about the source of fiction, and that I feel that fiction originates in the subconscious mind. There may be some cogitation, some sort of thought given to what you're going to write your next book about, what the plot will be, and indeed you may sit down and you may, in a very conscious way, develop the plot structure, the chapter structure, the course of events that are going to happen in the book. But I think all the time the subconscious mind is going over the story, and that's why when you're writing, and so many novelists will say this, that when you're writing, you can be surprised about what happens
next.
because something completely unexpected will happen. For example, in my Botswana books, I think in volume 3 of the Botswana books, Mr. J.L.B. Matakoni becomes depressed, and I hadn't realized until that particular page, as I was writing that page, I didn't think that he was going to become depressed, and sure enough, he became depressed. And so I find that the plot can change really considerably. This one that I've just finished, My Italian Bulldozer, All sorts of things happened there that hadn't happened in the original true story.
Is it quite closely related, though, the two?
What, to the true story?
Yeah.
Well, the true story isn't very true, Willie. No. I think I need to confess that.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, please, a big round of applause for Alexander McCall Smith. We will be taking questions, though.
Thank you.
How long do we have?